All right, welcome to Music Theory for Electronic Musicians, presented by Slam Academy, diatonic chord progressions and inversions. So in this lesson, we're going to look at these funky things called diatonic chord progressions, which are kind of your super secret weapon for knowing every possible chord in a key. There's a pattern you're going to memorize, and it's going to make it so you're going to walk into a gig and someone's going to say, we're playing in the key of E flat major. And without even thinking about it, you're going to know 7 chords that you could play that'll fit perfectly in with what's going on. And we're going to also talk about inversions, which is a fancy way to say making it sound less dumb, pretty much. That's what inversions are for. Okay, so let's have a look. So let's start by dissecting this diatonic chord progressions term a little bit so that we understand what it is. So diatonic means it's in a key. I think we may have talked about this in like the first lesson or maybe the second lesson, but diatonic means it's in a key. If we are playing diatonically, we are playing in a key. Doesn't matter what key for this word to apply, it just means we're playing in a key. Chromatic is the opposite of diatonic. It means we are not playing in a key. It means anything goes completely randomly. Any note is as important as any other note. Playing chromatically is fun sometimes. It usually sounds like hell, but sometimes it can sound good if you know what you're doing, or playing in a certain style, I should say. There are certain styles of music that rely on chromatic music, chromaticism, as we say. Particularly avant-garde music, things like that. Things that, if you are taking this class through Slam Academy, is probably not your main cup of tea. But it can also be a really useful trick to work with chromatic stuff if you're, let's just say, hypothetically, scoring a film. Let's say you're scoring a film and it's a horror movie and there's something really terrible happening. Reach over into chromatic music and you'll be able to make it sound pretty horrible pretty fast. I know that sounds funny, but it's true. That's kind of what we do often when we're working in film. So the word chromatic is also used when talking about color. We talk about chromatic, and it kind of means like all the colors, right? So that kind of makes it make a little more sense for how we use it with music. It kind of just means all the notes. You'll find that a lot of music terms borrow themselves from color. One word that we use a lot, and you might find when you get into programming a synthesizer or something, is the word timbre. Timbre is just Italian for color. But we use it to describe like the quality of the sound. Is it bright? Is it sharp? Is it dark? So timbre means that. But we're not talking about timbre right now. We're talking about diatonic chord progressions. So that's what chromatic means. It means playing any note, not playing in a key. Diatonic means we are in a key. And that's what we're going to focus on now. So diatonic chord progressions. Diatonic chord progression means all the chords in a key. So what this is going to show us is how to find all the chords in a key in a systematic way to know the quality of those chords. And by quality, I mean major, minor, or in one case, this other weird thing that we'll talk about in a minute, but mostly major or minor. So all the chords in the key, all the triads in the key is what I should actually say. All the triads in the key of blank, whatever key we're working in. So in order to demonstrate this, let's bop on over to Ableton Live and look at it there. It's a little more easy to explain when we're looking at it on the piano roll editor. Okay, here we are over in Ableton Live. I am going to start us off by first drawing in all the notes of C major again. So here they are. There's a C. So we have whole step, half step. You're totally getting sick of hearing me say this pattern over and over, but I want to be sure you understand it. Whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, right? There is our notes. There are our notes. There the notes are. How about that? Okay. So there's our notes. Now, in order to figure out the diatonic chord progression, essentially what I'm going to do here is I am going to build a triad on every note of the scale. So I'm going to my first chord is going to use C as the root, right? Then the root is the note that the chord is named after. So the first one's going to be built on C. The second one, I'm going to build the chord on D, and then on E, then on F, then on G, etc. I'm going to build all of those chords, and then we'll have them all laid out. Now, we don't know yet which of those chords are going to be major and minor, but that's the pattern. As soon as we figure that out, which we're going to learn right now, then we know going forward, like, oh, the third chord in the scale is minor. Like, we just know that, and you can get really comfortable with this pattern. So let's figure it out. So first, we're going to do a C major. Let's just do it right here. So I'm just going to extend this note. So our first chord, so I have, remember we're looking for the root, the third, and the fifth of the chord. So in the key of C major, root, skip the second, go to the third, skip the fourth, go to the fifth. So there is my first chord. That's a C chord, C major chord with the root on C, so it's a C chord. Okay, let's do the next one. So I'm going to build one with a root on D. So there it is. There's my D. So now I need the root, third, and fifth, but I am sticking to the key of C here. So I'm using these notes. So C, skip one. That gets me to my third. That's an F. So in the key of C, this is our root. This is the second. This is the third. So that's the one I need. This is the fourth. This is the fifth. So that's the one I need. Root, third, fifth. So here's my second chord. That's my second chord. And that's a D chord. We don't know if it's major or minor yet. Maybe you do. But let's keep going. Next one is E. So there's an E. And then I skip the second of E. And I go to the third. Skip the fourth. And I go to the fifth. There's my chord built on E, my E triad. Let's keep going. Next one. This chord is going to be built on the fourth scale degree of C major, and that's F. So here's F. Skip the second of F. Go to the third. Skip the fourth, and go to the fifth. There's my F chord. I'm going to keep on going here to the fifth scale degree, which is G. There's my G, skip a note, gets me my third, skip a note, there's my fifth. So now I'm going up into the next octave in order for this to work. So let's just put all the notes of C major again here, but we'll do them in the next octave. So here's C. So I just do the pattern over again. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. We're not going to need to go up that high, but there they are. So now I have my G chord. There it is. Stretch that one out for us. Okay, so that was my fifth scale degree here. Let's go up to the sixth scale degree. It's an A. So I'll put that there. And then I skip a note. I get the third of that A. Scroll up a little bit. I skip a note and I get the fifth of A. Stretch that out. All right, one more. I get to the seventh scale degree. That would be a B. So I put in a B, skip a note. That gives me my third of B, skip a note, and that gives me my fifth of B. Let's stretch that out. And then just to complete this cycle, let's go up one more. This puts us back at C. This is back where we started, but an octave higher. So let's put that here. C, I skip a note, gets me my third. I skip a note, and fifth. We'll stretch that out. So these notes should be exactly the same as my first chord, C, E, and G. If I go back down to here, C, E, and G. They're the same, just an octave higher. Okay, so that is my diatonic chord progression. That's what we are looking at right here. So I'm going to delete my initial C major scale so we can hear what this sounds like. Get rid of all this, otherwise we're just going to hear this big cluster. That's what we call it, by the way, when you play all the notes at once of a key. We call it a cluster. Okay, I'm going to slow this down so we hear it nice and slow. Here is the diatonic chord progression played in order. Cool. So there they all are. There's all our chords. That's what we need to remember. So next thing we need to know is we need to learn the pattern, right? So I'm going to draw this on here. Okay. So the pattern is going to be a series of minor chords and major chords in an order with one funky one. So our first chord here, this is a C, E, G. We are in the key of C major, so we know our first chord is going to be a major chord. So here's how we're gonna, some common abbreviations for you, by the way. We looked at some abbreviations last time, but minor chords, lowercase m, that's what we did last time. Major chords, we do M-A-J, or sometimes we just do a capital M. So I'm gonna do lowercase m for minor, capital M for major. So this first chord is major. And it's the first one. So let's put a 1. In music theory, we use Roman numerals for a lot of stuff. I hate Roman numerals. I'm just going to tell you that right now. I hate Roman numerals. But that's what we use. So the first chord, and we call it the 1, is major. Let's look at the second chord. So this is the second chord. We'll use a Roman numeral 2. And now, is this major or minor? Remember our tricks last time. We had 2 different tricks, and I promised you a third one. So we're doing the third one right now. But our 2 initial tricks were, 1, just listen to it and see, does it sound major or minor? The other one was count the half steps. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 half steps meant a minor. We don't need to count the half steps up to the 5th because we don't care. All we really care about is that third, that middle note, right? That's the one that tells us if it's major or minor. So it's 4 half steps to that third, which means it's got to be a minor chord. So we're going to call that one minor. Let's look at 3. Is this one major or minor? 1, 2, 3, 4. It is also minor. See how I'm getting that? It's the third is all we care about. And we're just finding out this pattern, this major, minor, minor pattern, because it's going to be the same. Let's look at the fourth chord. Is this one major or minor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is major. How about the 5 chord? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is also major. All right, how about the 6 chord? 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is minor. I'm going to write that down here. Over here we have the 7 chord. And this one is the one that I've alluded to a couple times. That's neither major nor minor. If we look at our third, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's minor. But this one has an extra weird little quality to it that we won't need to go into right now. But suffice it to say, it's kind of like a super minor chord. We call it a diminished chord, sometimes abbreviated dim or with a little tiny circle. So the 7th is the weird one. It's a diminished chord. Now, to explain that a little bit more, the diminished chord is really ugly sounding. Let's have a listen really quick here. Let me shift it down an octave just so that you can hear it. There we go. It's ugly. It doesn't have a really good use for us, for the kind of music that I'm assuming most people in this class are going to be taking. Its best quality is it's transitional, meaning it pushes to something else. It makes you, it can really make the music like cook, push forward in a way. You don't want to sit on this chord for a long time, but to help you move on to a new section, this chord can be really powerful. The diminished chord. Um, Incidentally, this chord has an interesting history to it. It was uh, back in the Middle Ages when all music was run by the church. Playing this chord or singing this chord, if you were in a choir, or if you were a composer writing this chord, would pretty much guaranteed get your head chopped off for doing this chord. Um, there's another kind of fancier term for this chord, and it would be a Locrian chord. It's based on a Locrian pattern. And Locrian is not a word you need to remember, but it comes from the root word Latin for the word is loco, where we also know that word probably from Latin, Spanish, and a lot of languages in which loco means crazy, right? It's the crazy chord. It just sounds crazy. And it would get you killed because it was the devil chord, pretty much. So we're not going to use that one a whole lot, but it's there. So here we are back with the stuff. And our last chord here, we know that this chord is the same as our first chord. So we really don't even mark it. In Roman numerals, there's no such thing as 8. You don't do that. We would call this instead 1 because it's the same notes. And it's major because 1 down here is major, right? So our pattern, the diatonic chord progression pattern, is this. Including this. So that is to say, it is, I'll write it over here, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. That is the pattern. For every key, that pattern works. So we did this in C major, but if we were playing in D major and someone said, hey, go to the third chord of D major, you know it's a minor chord because 1, 2, 3. It's the third chord. It's got to be minor, right? Okay, let me look at this a little bit differently because I deceived you somewhat on these Roman numerals. And there's not going to be a theory test here. So the way you write these down, I don't really care. And I don't really care if you write them down at all. But in case you ever walk into a theory class, I want to be sure you do this right. So what we do to designate minor and major, if we're not doing the capital and lowercase m, is we use capital and lowercase Roman numerals. So, oops. So, major, 1. 2 is minor, so we use I, lowercase 2 in Roman numerals, just with I's. 3 is minor. So the way that we can see quickly whether or not that chord is major or minor is because of the lowercase or capital letters. 4 is major. 5 is major. 6 is minor. 7 we write as minor with this circle on it, meaning diminished. So there's our diminished circle. Don't write that. And then this would be 1 again. Excellent. So we're going to try a little experiment here and analyze a tune. So I have here a track called Sleeping In by this band called the Album Leaf. They do kind of, I don't know, electronic, down-tempo stuff. I kind of dig them. So let's just hear this opening keyboard riff, and then we're going to do a little analysis of it. So here it is. Okay, so it basically just started over again there with some extra bells, and soon drums come in and all that stuff. So I'm going to try a little experiment, and I just want to look at this intro part, so I'm just going to shorten this a little bit to save us a little bit of time. I'm going to use, and I've always wanted to do this, so I'm going to try this. I'm going to use Ableton Live's new convert to MIDI tool, so we can look at the notes here. So we're going to say convert harmony to new MIDI track. So what this is doing is it's analyzing all those notes and trying to figure out the pitches for us. So hopefully it gets them right, and then we can look over what they are and see how they're organized, and hopefully inside this track we find our diatonic chord progression. It won't be laid out as clearly as we did before. It's not going to be in order, but it'll still be there if they're playing in a key, which I think they are. Okay, so it's done. Here's our notes. Okay, so this is zoomed way out. So let's zoom in so we can see what we got here. Okay, let's hear it first, and let's just hear the Ableton's analysis version. Let's just hear this first couple chords. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Okay, cool. So let's organize these. So first thing we have is a B and a G. So let's go on the assumption that we're in the key of G major. I'm pretty sure we are, looking over it really quickly. So just trust me on that, and let's see if our system of diatonic chord progressions work in G. So what are the notes of G? Where can I lay this out? I'm going to do this. I'm going to take everything, I'm going to slide it forward a little bit, and then I'm just going to write down the notes of G for us. So it's G. Here's our pattern. I probably don't need to say it again for you. And so there's one octave. Let's do another octave. Maybe I need to go down another octave too, because we're all over the place. So I'm going to start on a low G. And then there's that. Okay, so I have 3 octaves laid out of our G. So let's pick this apart chord by chord. So here's our first chord. I'm going to slide this over so we can look at it right next to our G major scale here. So both these notes are in G because they're on our pattern, right? Let's shrink them a little bit. So I'm going to pull this note up an octave. So now we're right here. So if this was the one chord, right, we're missing a note. We only have 2 notes. But we do have, here's G, there's the second, and there's the third. We have the root and the third. We don't have a fifth, and that's okay. We don't need a fifth. We could just have 2 notes of the chord. It's still a chord, right? Remember, a chord means it's 2 notes. And if it's going to only be 2 notes, the fifth is the good one to leave off, because the root is kind of important, and the third is really important, right? Because that's how we know if it's a major or minor chord. So we have a 1 chord here. So let's mark that down. Okay, so here we have, in the key of G, we have 1. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look at our next chord. So the next thing we have is this note, and then these 2 at the same time. This note, this A, is not actually in either chord, I don't think. Well, actually, maybe it is. Let's assume it's in this next chord. They hit it a little early. Sometimes we do that if we want things to sound good. Just playing the notes of the chord one by one, that's fine. We can do that. So let's take all 3 of these notes. Let's brush them over here. Let's see if they're in our key. So there's F sharp, that's in key. There's A, that's in our key. And there's D, that's in our key. Let's flip this D up an octave. So now let's look at where this lies. And actually, just to make this a little easier, I'm going to flip this whole thing up another octave. So now let's look at where this D is in relation to the key of G. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the 5 chord. And if this is the 5 chord, we know from our diatonic chord progression, it must be major. Because remember, the diatonic chord progression said major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 must be major. So this is a major 5 chord in the key of G, and this is still our tonic, right? So we have a 1 and a 5. Let's look at what else we've got. Coming up next, we have, let's clump these notes together. And that's probably it. So these three are not going to work out as well. I'm going to call this E not part of the chord because it was a little early. Sometimes those early notes are part of the chord and sometimes they're not. If they're not part of the chord, we call it a passing tone. Passing tone just means it's not part of the chord. It's just a note that we threw in there to sound good. We can totally do that. So let's take this out of the equation, that E, and let's just deal with these two. Let's push this over here, and let's take these up an octave. And I want to get this F sharp above G, so I'm going to go up another octave. So what we have here is, a chord built on the 7th. Remember, we don't like those. That's going to be a diminished chord if it had all the right notes in it. But it doesn't. Actually, it does. Here's a little cheat I'm going to do. I'm going to move the upper note down an octave. So I just kind of reordered those. This is what we're going to talk about next. Now, I have a chord built on B. So in the key of G, this is 1, 2, 3. It's the 3rd scale degree, a chord built on the 3rd scale degree. So it's 3, so it must be minor. We don't have the 3rd here, though. 1, 2, 3. The 3rd would be D. It would be right here. And that's not in it. But the 5th, this is the correct 5th. So the 5th is in it. We're left out the 3rd here. And that creates kind of an empty sound when you don't have the 3rd because we don't know if it's major or minor. But it can be okay. Okay, so here's our chords, our 3 chords in order with that. So what we have here is a chord progression that is completely in key. It is 1, 5, 3. That's the chord progression for the beginning of this song. We kind of had to dissect it a little bit and nudge some things around to make it easier to see. And we switched some octaves just so that it would be easier to see. But hopefully you'll get good at spotting these. So compositionally, when we're writing a tune, let's say we're here. Oops. Let's say we've written this much. We've got our first chord, we've got our second chord. We like the way that sounds. And then we're like, what could come next? Well, we know we're in the key of G. So according to our pattern, we could use an A minor chord because that's 2 and the 2nd scale degree is minor according to our pattern. We could have a chord built on the 3rd scale degree, and that would be minor. We could put a C major in here because that's 4, and 4 is major in this key. Or in all keys, 4 is major, but in this key it would be C major, the key of G. In a chord built on the 5th scale degree would be on D, and that would be major. It would be the 5th. That's what we have here. We could also use an E minor because it's the 6th scale degree, and we know by our pattern that it's going to be minor. So, to sum all that up, do not forget this pattern. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and the funky diminished one. So this is a chord built on our first scale degree is major, our second is minor, our third is minor, our fourth is major, our fifth is major, our sixth is minor, and our seventh is this bizarre diminished one. That's the pattern that will tell you any note, any chord in a given key, what the quality of the chord is. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. Just get really good at saying that. I want you to fall asleep saying that, saying major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. You should be able to recite it in your dreams. Okay, let's move on to talking about inversions. Okay, so here's what inversion is. In a nutshell, you're probably hearing all these chords laid out and thinking, okay, I sort of get it that, we put the chords in the order, this is how we assemble them, blah, blah, blah. But these still sound like stupid chords. They don't sound like interesting music to me. That is why we're going to do inversions, because you would be correct. They do sound like stupid chords. So in this part, we're going to talk about how to make those chords sound a little hipper. Rather than just playing this diatonic chord progression thing, which isn't going to sound really interesting. All the notes will sound good together because they're all in key and they're all assembled properly, but they're not terribly interesting. Another thing about inversions is that if you noticed in the last section when we were working on the album leaf track, that last chord, I did a little trick to make it look correct, to make it be correct. And that was I moved one note down an octave and it crossed over the other note. That is an inversion. So let me explain in a little more detail. So here we have our diatonic chord progression again. Let's try to make an interesting sounding chord progression out of this. So let's just pick a couple chords. So let's use our tonic chord. Let's use, I don't know. Let's not use the 2 chord, but we'll leave the 3 chord. Maybe we'll use the 5 chord and the 6 chord. How about that? So I'm going to get rid of the 7th and 8th. Okay, so here we have a 4 chord progression. Let's maybe change the order of these. Let's put our 5 chord over here. And yeah, that works like that. So we're going to go 1 chord, 5 chord, 3 chord. 1 chord, 6 chord, 3 chord, 5 chord. All right. I'm just going to make these all get their own beat here. So I'm just going to spread these out a little bit. Okay. And then I'm going to have them fill. Okay. So now we have a progression that is 1, 6, 3, 5, right? So this is going to be a major chord. Our 6 is going to be a minor chord because it is by the diatonic chord progression pattern. Our 3 is going to be a minor chord because it is by the pattern. And our 5 is going to be a major chord. Okay, so here's what that sounds like. Okay, so that's our chord progression that we're going to work with here. The thing that makes it sound less interesting, basically the thing that makes it sound like Moby, is that all the chords are in root position. That means that they're all spelled exactly how we did it before, in the pattern of root, third, fifth. All of them have the root in the bottom. We call that root position. The lowest note is the root. Oops. So this is the root of this chord. This is the root. C is the root of that chord, and G is the root of that chord. The root is in the bottom. There's nothing wrong with having the root in the bottom. It's called root position. It's fine. But the chords don't flow into each other. The reason I said it sounds like Moby is because he does this all the time. He plays a whole bunch of chords in root position. See how different these 2 chords are. They're like miles away from each other. What we'd like to do is make them flow into each other a little bit better. And that's what an inversion is. An inversion means there's something that's not the root in the lowest note of the chord. So right now they're in root position, and there are names for the other positions. There's first inversion, second inversion, blah, blah, blah. I don't really care about any of that. All I care about is we're going to put this chord into an inversion, meaning we're going to put either the third or the fifth into the lowest note of the chord. That's the inversion that we're going to do. So it doesn't really matter which one. They have a slightly different sound depending on how you do it. But if you add a bass line, it's going to change the inversion completely anyway, right? Because that's now going to be whatever the bass is playing is going to be the lowest note in the chord. But for our purposes, let's just make these flow into each other a little bit better. So let's take this E and let's move it down an octave. Okay, so we just inverted this chord. All the same notes, just in a different order. And now it makes these two flow into each other a little bit better. Let's move this C down an octave as well. Look at that. Now we have two of the same notes. Between the 1 chord and the 6 chord, there's really only one note different. It wasn't as obvious when these two were up here. But when we take them down, we see that there's only one note different between those two chords. Interesting. So that makes these gel a whole lot better because now only one note needs to move. You know what we could even do is if we were using a synth that had a lot of sustain, we could even just do this and just let those ring. That would blend those two together really nicely. This piano doesn't have a lot of sustain, so I'm going to leave it so we re-attack these two notes here. Let's see what else we can do to make these other chords jive better. So let's try moving this B down an octave. Okay, that makes a nice little motion there. That's a nice motion. I've got this G chord, the 5 chord, all the way up here. Let's take this D down an octave. That's okay. Let's try taking this B down an octave. Hey, look at that. Now we have this kind of neat bass line that just is going to go between C and B over and over again, back and forth. This G stays the same. That's nice. This E moves down to a D. No big deal. Small amounts of motion. So now this chord progression will sound, it's all the same notes, all the same chords. If we wanted to get fancy and label it, we would label it all the same stuff. This is still a 1 chord. This is still a 6 chord, and it's minor. This is still a 3 chord, and it's minor, and this is still a 5 chord. But we've reorganized the notes to make them a little more cohesive, and this is going to have a little bit cooler of a sound to it. So let's hear that. See, now they blend together quite nicely. So that's what an inversion is. It's a pretty simple concept, but all it really means is to reorder the notes so that they flow in, so that the chords flow into each other a little bit better. The position is determined by the lowest note, or sometimes we say the note in the bass, meaning the lowest note of the chord. So in this case, I'm in root position still with this chord because the root is in the bottom. In this case, the root is all the way up here. So that's an inversion. In this one, the root is, what did I say this chord was? 3 chord. So the root is here. And in this one, the root is on the top. And that's totally okay. This is when we start to make this stuff actually get musical, you know? It starts to sound good, not just like we're playing a whole bunch of root position chords. Because if we did, we'd sound like Moby. And nothing against Moby, but he sounds like, to me, his music sounds like it was written by a 4th grader. So, maybe just for fun, I will do this. I'm going to take this. I'm going to let these notes sustain. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Since that note doesn't change, I'll just let that sustain. Same thing here. I'll let that sustain. And even this one here, check that out. This one goes all the way through. Okay, so now only notes that change get reattacked. Now, this isn't going to sound terribly interesting in a piano, so I'm going to switch this over to being on a synth that has a little more sustain to it, and we'll see how cool it sounds. Okay, so I threw a really big kind of lush synth sound on this, and queued up some drums. So here's what that same, all the exact same notes, I haven't changed a thing, sounds like when we put a synth on it. All right, so now you can see how we're starting to get there, right? We're starting to get to some interesting music. We're not just cycling through boring old chord progressions. We're actually creating some stuff. So we'll get into more and more of that as we move on to the next lesson. So hopefully I will see you there. Adios.